In the Oregon wilderness of 1892, a dismissed schoolteacher stood at the edge of an abandoned sawmill she'd inherited for $8. What started as a desperate attempt to rebuild her life took a horrifying turn when she discovered what the lumberjacks had really buried beneath the forest. Flor Abigail Turner wasn't your typical frontier woman seeking a fresh start. For 5 years, she had spent her life educating children in truth over comfort. Known for refusing to teach the sanitized version of history that cost her everything. When she encountered boot prints circling the mill at midnight and heard axes chopping in empty woods, she had no idea she was walking into a 26-year-old conspiracy. Abigail chose to dig deeper rather than run. A decision that would lead to unearthing 7 murdered workers, confronting a lumber baron who'd built his empire on blood, and burning the evidence to ash. What began as an $8 inheritance would become a reckoning with the dead. The Pacific Northwest timber town would never be the same after a schoolteacher forced the powerful to confess their sins and made sure the forest remembered every name of those who'd been silenced. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of sawdust never really leaves a place once it settles in. That's what I thought when I first stood at the edge of the clearing, looking at what used to be my Uncle Henry's mill. The Oregon forest pressed close on all sides, dense with Douglas fir and western hemlock that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. Even the air tasted like wood, sweet and sharp at the same time, like the forest itself was trying to warn me about something. I'd traveled 3 days by train and another half-day by wagon to reach this place. The driver who brought me from the nearest station kept glancing at me in his rearview mirror, his weathered face creased with something between pity and confusion. When I told him where I was headed, he actually stopped the horses. "You're Henry Caldwell's niece?" he'd asked. "I am. And you're planning to stay at the mill?" "I own it now. For $8, according to the deed." The driver had laughed then, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. $8 for a cursed piece of land and a building full of ghosts. That sounds about right for Henry's sense of humor. I didn't respond. What could I say? That I had no choice. That after the school board dismissed me for refusing to teach their sanitized version of history, this inheritance was the only option that didn't involve returning to my sister's house in shame. The driver seemed to understand my silence. He'd driven the rest of the way without speaking, depositing me and my 2 trunks at the edge of the property before hurrying away as if the shadows themselves might reach out and pull him in. Now I stood alone, studying what I'd bought for the price of a decent pair of boots. The main mill building sagged in the middle like an old horse ready to collapse. The water wheel that once powered the saw blades hung motionless, its wooden paddles green with moss. 3 worker cabins dotted the clearing, their windows empty and dark. Everything looked abandoned, forgotten, left to rot under the weight of the Pacific Northwest rain. But it was mine. All mine. The thought should have filled me with pride or at least satisfaction. Instead, I felt only a creeping unease that started at the base of my spine and worked its way up. I forced myself to move forward, my boots crunching on pine needles and broken glass. The clerk in town had given me a key, though he'd handled it like it might burn him. His hands had trembled as he pushed the deed across his desk. "Miss Turner," he'd said, not meeting my eyes, "I'm obliged to inform you about the property's history. I know my uncle ran a sawmill." "Yes, ma'am. But there was an incident. Back in '69, 7 men went missing during a storm. They say it was a collapse in the sorting shed, but..." He'd trailed off, licking his lips nervously. "But what?" "No bodies were ever recovered, ma'am. Some folks say they're still out there, buried somewhere in the woods." I'd thanked him for the information and left before he could see how his words affected me. Now, standing in front of the mill's main door, I pulled out the key and fitted it into the lock. The mechanism resisted at first, then gave way with a grinding sound that echoed through the clearing. The door swung inward, revealing darkness. I stepped inside, and the smell of sawdust intensified until it felt like breathing in the past itself. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light filtering through gaps in the walls. The interior was cavernous, filled with rusted machinery that looked like the skeletal remains of some massive creature. The main saw blade, easily 6 feet across, dominated the center of the room. Its teeth were brown with rust and something else that I didn't want to identify. Sawdust coated everything in a thick layer, undisturbed for years. My footprints were the first marks in what looked like decades of stillness. I walked carefully, running my hand along the wall until I found what I was looking for, a lantern hanging from a nail. Beside it sat a tin of matches, surprisingly dry considering the building's condition. The flame caught on my third try, casting dancing shadows across the space. That's when I saw it. Carved into one of the main support beams, about 6 feet up, were 2 names, Henry Caldwell and Silas Ward, along with a date, May 12, 1869, the same year as the collapse. The same year, 7 men vanished without a trace. I touched the carved letters, feeling the rough edges where a knife had dug into the wood. My uncle's handwriting, I was certain of it. I recognized the way he formed his letters from the few birthday cards he'd sent me over the years. But who was Silas Ward? And why had their names been carved together like a memorial or a confession? I spent the next 2 hours exploring the mill, cataloging what remained. The sorting shed that the clerk mentioned was nothing more than a pile of collapsed timber at the far end of the property. The worker cabins were empty, except for broken furniture and the nests of various animals. One cabin had a journal lying open on a table, its pages so water-damaged that only fragments of words remained visible. I could make out "the company" and "can't tell them" before the ink dissolved into meaningless stains. By the time I finished my inspection, dusk had settled over the forest. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I realized I'd need to make one of the cabins habitable for the night. The largest one had an intact roof and a fireplace that looked functional. I dragged my trunks inside and set about building a fire, using scraps of wood from the collapsed furniture. The fire caught quickly, too quickly, as if the wood had been waiting years for someone to burn it. Orange light filled the cabin, pushing back the shadows, but somehow making the darkness outside seem even more absolute. I ate a cold dinner from my provisions, listening to the sounds of the forest settling around me. Owls called to each other in the distance. Something larger moved through the underbrush, snapping branches. Then I heard it. The sound of an axe biting into wood, sharp and clear, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I froze, my bread halfway to my mouth. The sound came again, rhythmic and purposeful. Chop, chop, chop. Then silence. I stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the clearing. Nothing moved. No one was there. Yet I'd heard it clearly, unmistakably. Someone or something was cutting wood in the forest at night. The practical part of my mind insisted it was just a woodpecker or the forest settling. But the part of me that had grown up on frontier stories about haunted places knew better. I'd heard what I'd heard, and the forest wasn't offering any innocent explanations. I lay awake for hours that night, watching shadows dance on the ceiling, listening for the axe sounds to return. They didn't, but just before dawn, when exhaustion finally started to pull me under, I heard something else. Footsteps, heavy boots walking across the mill floor, slow and deliberate. They circled the main saw blade 3 times, then stopped. When I gathered the courage to look out the window, the mill stood empty and silent in the pre-dawn grey. But I knew what I'd heard. Someone or something was walking in my mill. The question was whether they were trying to warn me or welcome me home. I made the decision to visit town at first light before I could talk myself out of it. The isolation of the mill felt different in the morning, less threatening but more oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I needed supplies, workers if I could find them, and most importantly answers about what happened in 1869. The walk took 2 hours along a barely maintained logging road. My boots were caked with mud by the time I reached the edge of what the locals called Timber Ridge. Calling it a town was generous. Maybe 36 buildings clustered around a single main street, most of them looking as weathered and forgotten as my mill. A general store, a post office, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, and a small building with a faded sign reading Sheriff's Office. The few people on the street stopped talking when they saw me. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store actually backed inside and closed the door. 2 men loading lumber onto a wagon turned away, suddenly very interested in their work. I'd expected some curiosity about a stranger, but this felt different. This felt like fear. I pushed open the door to the general store and a bell jangled overhead. The interior was cramped and smelled of tobacco, coffee, and something medicinal. A thin man behind the counter looked up from his ledger, and his face went pale. "Miss Turner," he said, and I realized he knew exactly who I was. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir." "Edwin Morris. I run the post office, too." He gestured vaguely toward a corner where a small window and a sorting shelf had been built into the wall. I have some letters for you." "For your uncle, I mean. We've been holding them since he died." "Yes, ma'am." Morris disappeared into the back room and returned with a bundle of envelopes tied with string. His hands shook as he handed them over. "There's 15 of them. Most are from creditors, but a few," he swallowed hard. "A few are personal." I took the bundle, noting that the top envelope was addressed to Henry Caldwell in a woman's neat script. No return address. "Thank you. I also need supplies. Basic food stocks, lamp oil, nails, and tools if you have them. You're planning to stay." "At the mill? I am. I'm planning to reopen it, actually." The color drained completely from Morris's face. "Miss Turner, I don't think that's wise. That property, it's not safe. Because of the collapse in '69? Morris glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, though we were alone in the store. "That's what they call it. A collapse. But people here remember different. They remember men going to work one morning and never coming home. They remember the company saying there was an accident, but refusing to let families see the bodies. Said they were too badly damaged, buried under too much debris to recover." "What company?" "Mercer Timber. They owned half the forest back then, including the rights to all the land around your uncle's mill. After the accident, they bought out most of the smaller operations. Your uncle was one of the few who refused to sell, and then he died?" Morris's silence was answer enough. He began gathering my supplies, moving with jerky, nervous motions. "That'll be $7.30, Miss Turner." I paid him, noting how his fingers avoided touching mine when he made change. "Mr. Morris, one more question. Do you know a man named Silas Ward?" The bag of flour he was holding hit the counter with a thud. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found it carved at the mill." "Alongside my uncle's name. Silas Ward was the mill's foreman. He left town the night of the collapse. Never came back." Morris leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Miss Turner, if you're smart, you'll sell that property to the first person who offers and leave this place. Some graves are meant to stay closed." The bell over the door jangled, and Morris jerked back like he'd been burned. A woman entered, tall and solid, wearing a man's coat and a badge pinned to her shirt. Her face was weathered but sharp, her eyes taking in everything with the law officer's practiced assessment. "Morris," she said, nodding to the shopkeeper. Then her gaze settled on me. "You must be Abigail Turner. I'm Deputy Nora Briggs." "Deputy." I extended my hand, and she shook it with a grip that could crack walnuts. "I heard you arrived yesterday. Wanted to check in, make sure you're settling in all right." Her tone suggested this was anything but a social call. "I'm managing. That mill's been empty a long time. Things happen in empty places. Animals move in, boards rot. It's not safe for a woman alone." I felt my spine stiffen. "I appreciate your concern, Deputy, but I'm quite capable of assessing risk." "I'm sure you are. But there are some risks you can't see coming." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "Found this posted at the saloon this morning. Thought you should know." I unfolded the paper and read, "Notice, the property known as Caldwell Mill is under surveillance by Mercer Timber Company. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Unauthorized excavation forbidden." Excavation? I looked up at Deputy Briggs. Why would they care about excavation? A good question. I've been a deputy here for 3 years, and I've never seen Mercer post a notice like that before. Makes a person wonder what they think you might dig up. Morris had gone very still behind the counter, his face the color of old paper. Deputy Briggs noticed his reaction and smiled slightly, though there was no warmth in it. The way I see it, Miss Turner, you have 2 choices. You can pack up and leave, let the mill rot like everyone expects. Or you can stay and find out why an empty sawmill makes powerful people nervous. She moved toward the door, then paused. If you choose the second option, you should know that the sheriff's office won't necessarily be on your side. Sheriff Dunham has been very friendly with Mercer Timber for a long time. And you? I believe in the law, Miss Turner, even when that puts me at odds with my employer. She tipped her hat. Welcome to Timber Ridge. Watch your back. After she left, I gathered my supplies and headed to the post office section of the store. Morris moved like a man in a trance as he helped me, not meeting my eyes. As I was leaving, I heard him mutter something that might have been a prayer or a warning. Chains under the floorboards, he whispered. Old Charlie said there were chains under the floorboards. Said he heard them dragging at night. I turned back. Who's old Charlie? But Morris just shook his head and retreated into his back room, leaving me alone with my supplies, my questions, and a growing certainty that I'd inherited something far more dangerous than a failing sawmill. The walk back to the mill felt longer than the morning's journey. The forest seemed to lean in closer, and every snap of a branch made me jump. I kept thinking about Morris's words, chains under the floorboards. What kind of sawmill needed chains under the floor? And why did the memory of them still frighten a man decades later? When I finally reached the clearing, the mill looked different in the afternoon light. More menacing somehow, as if it knew I'd been asking questions in town. I carried my supplies into the cabin and then, despite my exhaustion, walked back to the main mill building. The floor was solid planks, worn smooth by years of boots and sawdust. I knelt down and pressed my ear against the wood, listening. At first, nothing. Then faintly I heard it, a hollow sound beneath, like there was space below the floor. Not just the normal gap between boards and earth, but an actual cavity. I spent the next hour searching for an access point, running my hands along the walls, checking every corner. Finally, near the base of the main support beam, where the names were carved, I found it. A section of floorboard slightly raised compared to the others. I wedged my fingers into the gap and pulled. The board came up with a groan of protest, revealing darkness below. The smell that rose from the cavity was ancient and wrong, like earth that had never seen sunlight. I lit my lantern and held it over the opening. Below, I could see a crawl space about 3 feet deep, extending under at least a quarter of the mill floor. And there, coiled in the dirt like a sleeping snake, was a heavy iron chain. Its links were thick and rust-covered, but I could still make out dark stains on the metal. Stains that looked disturbingly like old blood. My hands started trembling so badly I almost dropped the lantern. What had happened here? What had my uncle been part of? And why had he left this place to me, knowing what secrets it held? I was still kneeling there, staring into the darkness, when I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy boots on sawdust. I spun around, my heart hammering. The mill was empty, but the footsteps continued, circling the main saw blade, just like they had last night. And this time, as I watched in frozen horror, I saw sawdust stirring in the shape of boot prints. Invisible feet walking through the abandoned mill, tracing a pattern around and around the silent blade. Then the footsteps stopped, and in the sudden, terrible silence I heard a voice. Rough and distant, like it was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. Abigail, it knew my name. Whatever haunted this place knew my name. I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the cabin, my lungs burning and my vision swimming with tears and terror. I slammed the door shut and dragged my trunk against it, knowing it was useless against something that could walk through walls, but needing the illusion of safety anyway. My whole body shook as I collapsed onto the floor, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, but I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. Something in that mill had spoken my name. I spent the rest of the day barricaded in the cabin, jumping at every sound. The rational part of my mind tried to find explanations. An echo, a bird that sounded like speech. My own exhaustion playing tricks. But I'd been a teacher long enough to recognize when I was lying to myself. As darkness fell, I lit every lamp I had and built up the fire until the cabin was stifling. I sat at the small table and forced myself to examine the letters Morris had given me. Most were indeed bills and notices from creditors. But one envelope, the one in the woman's handwriting, caught my attention. It was postmarked 3 months before my uncle's death and came from Portland. I opened it carefully, aware that I was violating a dead man's privacy, but beyond caring at this point. The letter inside was brief. Henry, you cannot keep running from this. The truth demands acknowledgement, and the longer you delay, the more dangerous it becomes. They are growing restless. I can feel it even from here. You know what must be done. Burn the ledger or give it to someone who will expose it. Those are your only choices. If you do neither, they will come for you as they came for the others. You brought this on yourself. On all of us. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking. A ledger. Someone named M talk of them being restless. I thought of the footsteps in the mill, the chains under the floor, the 7 men who vanished in 1869. The restless dead. That night, the sounds began in earnest. Round midnight, I heard axes again, closer than before. Not just one, but multiple, all chopping in rhythm like a work crew. Then came the sound of saws, cutting through timber that wasn't there. The whistle that signaled shift changes. Men's voices, muffled and distant, calling to each other in words I couldn't quite make out. I stayed perfectly still in my bed, covers pulled up to my chin, watching the window. The sounds went on for hours, rising and falling like waves. At one point I heard someone laughing high and wild, before it cut off abruptly, just before dawn. When I'd almost convinced myself it was over, I heard the dragging sound, heavy, rhythmic, like something being pulled across the ground outside my cabin. It circled the building 3 times, and with each pass, I could feel the cabin shake slightly, as if whatever was out there weighed more than anything living should. Then, silence. I waited until full daylight before I opened the door. The clearing looked normal in the morning sun, peaceful even. Birds sang in the trees. A light mist rose from the ground. But when I stepped outside and looked down, I saw them. Boot prints. Dozens of them, crisscrossing the clearing in chaotic patterns. Some were fresh, pressed deep into the mud. Others were barely visible, as if the men who made them weighed nothing at all. And leading away from my cabin, disappearing into the forest, were 2 deep parallel grooves in the earth. Like something heavy had been dragged into the woods, I followed the grooves, telling myself I was being foolish, but unable to stop. They led past the collapsed sorting shed, past the rusted machinery, into a section of forest, where the trees grew so close together the ground never saw direct sunlight. The air here smelled different, stale and cold, like a cellar that's been closed up too long. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The grooves ended at a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. In the center of the clearing, partially covered with needles and debris, was something metal. I knelt down and brushed away the forest litter, revealing a shovel. It was old but not rusted, as if it had been used recently. Beside it, tangled in the roots of a massive hemlock, was a scrap of red flannel. I picked up the fabric and my blood ran cold. It was fresher than anything else out here, the color still vibrant. Someone had been here recently, maybe last night. That's when I saw it. At the base of the hemlock, the ground had been disturbed. Not just the natural upheaval of roots, but actual digging. Fresh digging. I used the shovel to clear away more of the surface soil, working with a feverish intensity I didn't fully understand. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something solid. Wood. Rotted, but unmistakable. I brushed away more dirt, my hands shaking, and revealed the corner of what could only be a coffin lid. I jerked back, dropping the shovel. This was it. This was what Morris had meant. This was what the men in town were afraid of. My uncle's mill wasn't just the site of an accident. It was a graveyard, and someone had been digging up the bodies. I stared at the exposed corner of the coffin, my mind racing. Should I keep digging? Go back to town and get Deputy Briggs? Leave this place and never look back? Every instinct screamed at me to run, but a deeper part of me, the part that had refused to teach lies to children, knew I couldn't. If men were buried here in secret, if my uncle had been part of covering it up, then I had a responsibility to uncover the truth. I reached for the shovel again. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me. Real footsteps this time, crushing needles and snapping twigs. I spun around, the shovel raised like a weapon. A man stood at the edge of the clearing. He was grey-bearded and gaunt, dressed in clothes that looked like they'd been worn for decades. His left leg dragged slightly as he moved forward, but it was his eyes that held me frozen. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen things that broke him. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "You should have stayed away like the others did. Who are you?" He smiled, but it was a terrible expression full of guilt and sorrow. "Name's Silas Ward, miss. I used to be the foreman of this mill. Before everything went to hell," my grip on the shovel tightened. "That was you." "Last night?" The dragging sounds. Wasn't me, was them. They drag things at night, trying to show people where they're buried. "Where we buried them?" His eyes drifted to the exposed coffin lid. "You found one." "There's 6 more out here." "Maybe 7. I lost count." "You buried them? You helped cover up the murders?" "Wasn't supposed to be murders." Silas moved closer, and I could see tears tracking through the dirt on his face. "Was supposed to be an accident. The sorting shed collapsed, killed 7 men. We'd give their families money, and Mercer would get the timber rights. That's what your uncle agreed to, what we all agreed to. But then, what happened? They didn't die in the collapse, Miss Turner. Mercer's men took them into the woods first. Made sure they wouldn't talk about what they'd seen. Made sure there'd be no witnesses to contradict the official story." He sank down onto a fallen log, his whole body shaking. "Your uncle didn't know." "Not until after. By then, we were all guilty. All part of it. I felt sick." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your uncle tried to make it right at the end. Started writing everything down, names and dates and what really happened. Made a ledger. Hid it somewhere in the mill's foundation. Said someone would find it someday. Someone brave enough to expose the truth." Silas looked up at me. "Then Mercer's men found out what he was doing. And your uncle had an accident of his own. They killed him, made it look like his heart gave out. But I knew. I always knew." He stood slowly, wincing at the pain in his leg. "That ledger is still hidden somewhere. If you find it, you can prove what happened. But, Miss Turner, the moment you start digging into this, you put yourself in danger. Mercer Timber doesn't forgive people who threaten their reputation. Then why tell me at all? Why not let me walk away?" Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He held it out to me. It was a wooden talisman carved with a single word, "Forgive," because them men out there in the woods, they won't rest until someone tells their story. They've been waiting 26 years for justice. And if you don't help them, they'll keep walking these woods, keep making those sounds, keep dragging their chains at night. They'll haunt this place forever. He pressed the talisman into my hand. "Your uncle left you this mill because he knew you were the only one brave enough to finish what he started." Before I could respond, Silas turned and limped back into the forest. I called after him, but he didn't stop. Within moments, he'd vanished into the trees as completely as if he'd never been there at all. I looked down at the talisman in my hand, then at the exposed coffin below me. Somewhere in the mill's foundation, my uncle had hidden evidence of murder, evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful companies in the territory, evidence that might get me killed. I should have been terrified, and I was. But more than that, I was angry. Angry at the men who'd murdered workers to protect their profits. Angry at my uncle for being part of the cover-up, even if he'd tried to make amends. Angry at a world where 7 men could disappear and everyone would just accept it. I'd come here expecting to restart a mill. Instead, I'd inherited a graveyard and a conspiracy. The question was what I intended to do about it. The sun was directly overhead now, filtering through the hemlock branches, illuminating the exposed coffin. I could walk away, sell the property, return to teaching somewhere far from here. Let the dead stay buried. Or I could dig. I chose to dig. By the time I finished uncovering the coffin, my hands were blistered and my dress was caked with mud. The lid was partially rotted, making it easy to pry open with the shovel. Inside, wrapped in what remained of a burial shroud, were the bones of a man. His skull showed clear signs of trauma, not from a collapsed building, from something much more direct and violent, murder. Just like Silas said, I covered the coffin back up, my hands shaking with exhaustion and emotion. Then I made my way back to the mill, my mind spinning with plans. I needed to find that ledger. I needed proof. And I needed to be very, very careful about who I trusted. The mill loomed ahead of me, dark against the afternoon sky. As I approached, I could have sworn I saw shadows moving in the windows, shapes that looked like men watching me return. But when I blinked, they were gone. The mill was waiting. The dead were waiting. And somewhere in its foundation, the truth was waiting too. I just had to be brave enough to uncover it. I spent the rest of that day searching the mill's foundation, tapping on stones, prying at loose mortar, looking for any sign of a hiding place. The foundation was old-fashioned, built from river rock and thick cement that had hardened over decades. Finding a secret cavity seemed impossible, but I knew it had to be there. Silas had been too certain. My uncle had been too careful. The sun was setting when I finally found it. Not in the main foundation wall, but in the base of the central support beam, the one with the carved names. I'd noticed earlier that the beam sat on a stone pedestal about 2 feet high. When I examined it more closely, I realized one of the stones at the base was slightly different in color, as if it had been replaced more recently than the others. I worked at it with a prying bar I'd found among the tools, sweat dripping down my face despite the evening chill. The stone resisted, then suddenly gave way with a grinding sound that echoed through the empty mill. Behind it was a hollow space, maybe a foot deep and 2 feet wide. Inside sat an iron box, small and rusted but intact. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. It was heavier than I expected, and when I shook it gently, I heard papers shifting inside. This was it. This had to be the ledger Silas mentioned. I carried the box back to my cabin, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The forest felt different now, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. I could feel eyes watching from the shadows between the trees, though I saw nothing when I looked directly. Inside the cabin, I set the box on the table and lit every lamp. The lock was rusted solid, but a few strikes with a hammer broke it open. The lid lifted with a protesting squeal of metal. Inside were 3 items: a leather-bound ledger, several loose pages that looked like journal entries, and a folded piece of paper that, when I opened it, revealed a hand-drawn map of the surrounding forest. I started with the journal pages. My uncle's handwriting, shaky and desperate. March 15th, 1892. I can't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. 7 men. Young men, most of them. They trusted me. They believed me when I said the work was safe, that Mercer would take care of them. I didn't know what Elias planned. I swear before God I didn't know. When he said take care of the witnesses, I thought he meant paying them off, sending them away with enough money to start over somewhere else. But that's not what he meant. The next page was dated 2 months later, May 2nd, 1892. Silas came to see me tonight, drunk, crying, said he can hear them in the woods. Said they call his name when he walks past the old sorting shed. I told him it's guilt talking, not ghosts. But I hear them too. God help me, I hear them too. I've decided to write it all down. Every name, every payment, every lie we told. If something happens to me, if Mercer decides I'm too dangerous to leave alive, then at least there will be a record. At least someone might find the truth. The final page was dated just weeks before his death. September 18th, 1892, I'm leaving everything to Abigail. My sister's girl. She has her mother's spine and her father's sense of justice. If anyone can finish what I'm too cowardly to complete, it's her. Elias knows I've made the ledger. His men are watching the mill. I don't have much time, but I've hidden it well, and I've left enough clues that a smart woman will find it. Abigail, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. Sorry for the burden I'm placing on you. Sorry for the danger, but these men deserve justice. Their families deserve the truth, and I'm too weak to give it to them. Forgive me. I sat back, tears blurring my vision. My uncle had known. He'd known he was going to die, and he'd chosen me anyway. Chosen to pull me into this nightmare because he believed I was strong enough to see it through. I wiped my eyes and reached for the ledger. It was meticulous, detailed, damning. Page after page of entries showing payments from Mercer Timber Company to various individuals. Payments to the sheriff, to the town doctor who signed false death certificates, to the county clerk who altered land records, and there, on a page marked Final Solution, May 12, 1869, were 7 names. Thomas O'Brien, $200 paid to family. Samuel Chen, $150 paid to family. Marcus Wade, $200 paid to family. Jonah Reed, $175 paid to family. Patrick Donnelly, $200 paid to family. William Cross, $150 paid to family. Jacob Dietrich, $200 paid to family. Beside each name, in my uncle's handwriting, were the words, paid in full, as if money could ever pay for a man's life, as if silver could wash away blood. The map showed the forest around the mill with 7 X marks scattered through the trees. 7 graves. I'd found one already. 6 more were waiting. I spent the rest of the night studying the documents, memorizing names and dates. By dawn, I had a clear picture of what happened. Mercer Timber had wanted the timber rights to a large tract of forest. My uncle's mill sat in the middle of it. Rather than buy him out, Mercer had orchestrated an accident to scare other small operators into selling. 7 workers were murdered to make the accident look real. The families were paid off. The bodies were secretly buried in the forest, and everyone who knew the truth was either bought or dead. The morning light brought a strange calm. I knew what I had to do, even if the thought terrified me. I needed to take this evidence to someone who could act on it. Deputy Briggs seemed like the logical choice, but she'd warned me the sheriff was in Mercer's pocket. Going through official channels could get me killed before anyone saw the ledger. I was still trying to decide my next move when I heard horses outside. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the ledger and shoved it under the loose floorboard where I'd hidden my money. The journal pages and map went into my dress pocket. Through the window I saw 3 riders approaching. One of them wore a fine suit that looked absurdly out of place in the muddy clearing. The other 2 were clearly hired muscle, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. The man in the suit dismounted with practiced ease and walked directly to my cabin door. He knocked, polite and patient, as if this were a social call. "Miss Turner? My name is Elias Mercer. I believe we should talk." My blood went cold. Mercer himself, here, now. How did he know I'd found the ledger? Unless he had someone watching the mill. Unless he'd known all along what I was searching for. I opened the door, keeping my body between him and the interior of the cabin. Up close, Elias Mercer was younger than I expected. Maybe 50, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that were almost kind. Almost, if you didn't look too closely at the calculation behind them. "Mr. Mercer, this is unexpected." "Is it?" He smiled, and it transformed his face into something charming, almost grandfatherly. "I make it my business to welcome new property owners in the area, especially those who might be overwhelmed by the challenges of running a mill alone. I'm managing just fine. I'm sure you are. You strike me as a resourceful woman, Miss Turner. Much like your uncle." He glanced past me into the cabin. "May I come in?" "I have a business proposition that I think will interest you." Everything in me screamed to refuse, but I stepped aside. Better to know what he wanted, what he knew. I gestured to the chair by the cold fireplace. He sat with the ease of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Let me be direct," Mercer said. "This mill hasn't operated profitably in years. The equipment is outdated, the building is unsafe, and the timber rights in the immediate area have already been harvested. Keeping it will cost you money you don't have. Perhaps I'm prepared to offer you $500 for the property. That's generous, given its condition. More than generous, actually. You could return to teaching. Start fresh somewhere new." His eyes locked on mine. "Put the past behind you." There it was, the threat wrapped in kindness. "What if I don't want to sell?" "Then you'd be making a mistake." The warmth drained from his voice like water from a broken barrel. "This is dangerous country, Miss Turner. Accidents happen. Buildings collapse. Women traveling alone go missing. It would be a shame if anything happened to you simply because you were too stubborn to accept a fair offer. Is that what happened to my uncle? An accident?" Mercer's smile never wavered. "Your uncle died of heart failure. The doctor was very clear about that. Tragic, certainly, but natural. These things happen to men who carry too much guilt. The implication was clear. He knew about the ledger, knew my uncle had been planning to expose him, and he was telling me, in the politest possible way, that he'd killed before and would kill again. "I'll consider your offer," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Don't consider too long. This opportunity won't last forever." He stood, brushing sawdust from his expensive trousers. "One more thing, Miss Turner. I've noticed you've been digging in the forest. Looking for something, perhaps? I should warn you that unauthorized excavation on disputed land can result in legal action. Mercer Timber has certain interests in preserving the forest as it is. Disputed land. This is my property, is it?" He pulled a folded document from his jacket. "According to county records, the eastern section of your property, including a significant portion of the forest, was actually transferred to Mercer Timber in 1869. A clerical error, perhaps. Or perhaps your uncle lost it in a business arrangement he never mentioned to you." He left the document on the table and walked to the door. His men mounted their horses, hands still resting on their guns. Mercer paused in the doorway. "You seem like a smart woman, Miss Turner. Smart enough to know when you're out of your depth. Take the money, leave, live a long, quiet life teaching children their letters. The alternative—" He shook his head sadly. "Well, some graves should stay closed. For everyone's sake." After they left, I unfolded the document. It looked official, complete with stamps and signatures. But the date bothered me. May 15, 1869, 3 days after the murders. 3 days after my uncle helped bury 7 men in the forest. This wasn't a clerical error. This was the payment Mercer had given my uncle. Blood money paid in stolen land. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the table with the ledger in front of me, comparing the entries to the document Mercer had left. The more I studied it, the more clearly I understood the full scope of what had happened. My uncle hadn't just helped cover up murders. He'd been paid for it, paid in land rights that should have made him wealthy. But guilt had eaten him alive anyway, until he couldn't stand it anymore. Around midnight I heard the now familiar sounds of axes and saws echoing through the forest. But tonight they sounded different, angrier, more urgent. Like whoever was cutting wood out there was trying to tell me something. I grabbed a lantern and, against every shred of common sense, walked out into the clearing. The sounds were coming from the old sorting shed, or what remained of it. The collapsed timber that everyone said had killed 7 men, even though we all knew now that was a lie. As I approached, the sounds stopped. In their place came something else. Whispers, dozens of them layering over each other until I couldn't make out individual words. Just a rising chorus of voices that sounded like pleading, like accusations, like desperate prayer. Then, through the broken timbers of the collapsed shed, I saw movement. A figure, tall and thin, picking through the debris. He moved with an odd, jerky rhythm, as if his body didn't quite remember how to work properly. "Who's there?" My voice cracked on the words. The figure stopped, turned, and in the lantern light I saw his face. It was scarred badly, with old burns that had healed badly. His clothes were ancient, rotting off his frame. But his eyes were alive and aware and fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You're Henry's girl," he said. His voice sounded wrong, like it was coming from somewhere deep underwater. "You found his book. Who are you?" "I'm the one who shouldn't be here." He stepped closer, and I saw that he walked with a limp, favoring his left side. "I'm the one they buried, but didn't stay buried. I'm Jonah Reed. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to drop the lantern and sprint back to the cabin. But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because Jonah Reed had been one of the names in the ledger. One of the 7 men murdered in 1869. That was 26 years ago. You can't be, I whispered. You're supposed to be dead. I was. His laugh was bitter and broken, or close enough to it. They beat us, dragged us out here, made us dig our own graves. Then they hit us with shovels until we stopped moving. Or they thought we stopped moving. He moved into the fuller light of my lantern, and I could see the extent of his scars. Burns covered the left side of his face and neck, disappearing down into his collar. His hands were twisted, the fingers bent at unnatural angles. I woke up in the dark, with 6 feet of dirt on top of me. Took me 3 hours to dig myself out. By then the others were... He shook his head. I was the only one who survived. Why didn't you go to the authorities? Tell them what happened. And say what? That I clawed my way out of a grave? That Mercer's men tried to kill me? Who would believe a half-dead Irishman over the richest man in the territory? He gestured at his face. Besides, look at me. I got caught in a shed fire trying to stay warm that first winter. Burned so bad I wish they'd finished the job in that grave. You've been living out here all this time? Where else would I go? This is where my friends are buried. Where the truth is buried. He looked at me with those burning, desperate eyes. But you found Henry's ledger. You can prove what happened. You can make someone listen. Mercer already knows. He came here today, threatened me. Then you're in danger. Real danger. He's killed before, Miss Turner. He'll kill again to protect what he's built. Jonah reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A wooden token, identical to the one Silas had given me. The men out here, the ones who didn't make it out of the ground, they've been waiting for someone brave enough to tell their story. How do you know about them? About what happens at night? Because I hear them too. The axes, the voices. Sometimes I see them, walking through the trees like shadows. They don't rest, Miss Turner. Can't rest. Not while their families think they died in an accident. Not while Mercer walks free, a branch cracked in the forest behind us. Jonah's head snapped up, his body going rigid. Someone's coming, his men. They must have followed you. He grabbed my arm with his twisted fingers. Listen to me. There's a clearing, 1/2 mile north of here. Old stone marker shaped like a cross. The earth there is soft. That's where they buried us. That's where you'll find the proof you need. What kind of proof? The kind that won't fit in a ledger. The kind that doctors can't lie about. He pushed me toward the cabin. Go now! And Miss Turner, when you dig them up, tell their families the truth. Tell them it wasn't an accident. Tell them their men didn't die because they were careless. They died because they knew too much. And Elias Mercer valued timber rights more than human lives. I heard voices now, multiple men calling to each other in the forest. Torches flickered between the trees. Jonah melted back into the shadows of the collapsed shed, vanishing so completely I could almost believe I'd imagined him. Almost. I ran back to the cabin and barricaded the door. Through the window, I watched torches surround the clearing, men moving in an organized pattern, searching. They didn't come to my door, didn't call out. Just walked the perimeter like wolves circling prey, letting me know they could reach me whenever they chose. They stayed until dawn, then disappeared as silently as they'd come. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, clutching the ledger and journal pages. Jonah Reed was alive. The man everyone thought was dead had been living in the forest for 26 years, watching, waiting, hoping someone would finally tell the truth. And now that someone was me, the question was whether I'd live long enough to do it. I waited until the next afternoon before making my move. I couldn't do this alone, and there was only one person in Timber Ridge who might help me. I took the ledger, wrapped it in oilcloth, and walked the 2 hours to town with my heart hammering against my ribs the entire way. Deputy Nora Briggs was at her desk when I burst through the sheriff's office door. She looked up surprised, then her eyes narrowed when she saw my face. What happened? I need your help, and I need you to decide right now whether you work for the law or for Elias Mercer. She stood slowly, hand moving instinctively toward her gun belt. Not threatening, just cautious. That's a hell of a thing to say to a deputy. I found my uncle's ledger. I have proof that Mercer murdered 7 men in 1869 and paid off half the town to cover it up. I unwrapped the oilcloth and set the ledger on her desk, including proof that the sheriff took money to falsify the investigation. Nora stared at the ledger like it was a coiled snake. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she reached out and opened it, her eyes scanning the pages. I watched her face change as she read, watched anger and disgust replace her careful neutrality. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "He paid Sheriff Dunham $300 to look the other way while men were murdered, and that's just one entry. There are dozens more. Payments to the doctor, the county clerk, the land office. Everyone who could have stopped it got paid to stay silent." Nora closed the ledger carefully, her jaw tight. "You know what this means, don't you? If we expose this, it won't just bring down Mercer. It'll bring down half the establishment in this county, including my boss. I know. They'll come after you. After both of us. They're already coming after me." Mercer's men surrounded my cabin last night. I met one of the men who was supposed to be dead, Jonah Reed. He's been living in the forest for 26 years because he was too scared to come forward. Too scared of what Mercer would do to him. I leaned forward, my hands flat on her desk. "I'm tired of being scared, Deputy Briggs. Those men deserve justice. Their families deserve the truth." Nora studied my face for a long moment. Then she stood, took off her badge, and set it on the desk beside the ledger. "Then we'd better move fast. Once word gets out that you came here, we'll have maybe a few hours before Mercer sends his men." "What are you doing?" "I'm choosing the law over my paycheck." She opened a drawer and pulled out a revolver, checking the chamber. "You said Jonah told you where the bodies are buried." "Half a mile north of the mill. A clearing with a stone crossmarker. Then that's where we start. If we can exhume even one body and prove the cause of death wasn't an accident, we'll have enough to force a real investigation. Even Mercer can't cover up physical evidence of murder." She grabbed a coat and a canvas bag. "We'll need shovels. Witnesses if we can find them. And a lot of luck. We made it back to the mill just before sunset." Nora had brought 2 shovels, a camera, and a grim determination that matched my own. I led her north into the forest, following the landmarks Jonah had described. The trees here grew so close together that we had to walk single file, branches catching at our clothes and hair. The clearing appeared suddenly, a break in the dense canopy where grey light filtered down. In the center stood the stone marker Jonah had mentioned, weathered and leaning, but unmistakably cross-shaped. The ground around it was uneven, marked with subtle depressions that could have been natural, or could have been where the earth had settled over buried bodies. "Which one?" Nora asked, setting down her bag. I pulled out my uncle's map, comparing it to the clearing. "That one. The closest to the marker. According to the ledger, that should be Thomas O'Brien." We started digging as the light began to fail. The earth was soft, just like Jonah said, and our shovels bit deep with each thrust. 1 foot down, 2 feet, 3. The work was hard, and my hands blistered quickly, but I didn't stop. Neither did Nora. At 4 feet, my shovel hit something solid, wood, rotted and soft, but unmistakable. We both stopped, breathing hard, and looked at each other. "This is it," Nora said quietly. "Once we open this, there's no going back." "I know." We cleared away more earth, exposing the top of a crude coffin. The wood was so decayed in places that I could see through to the darkness below. Nora took out her camera and photographed the grave from multiple angles, documenting everything. Then we pried open the lid. The smell that rose from the coffin was ancient and wrong, earth and rot and something else I couldn't identify. Inside, wrapped in the remains of a burial shroud, was a skeleton. But as Nora leaned closer with the lantern, her face went pale. "That's not Thomas O'Brien," she said. "How do you know?" "Because O'Brien was a laborer. Young man, early 20s according to the records." She pointed at the skull. "This man was older, much older. And look at his hands. Those are gentlemen's hands, not a worker's. The bones are smaller, more refined." My stomach dropped. "Then who is it?" Nora reached carefully into the coffin and extracted something from inside the skeleton's coat pocket. A leather wallet, so rotted it fell apart in her hands. But inside was a piece of paper, folded and remarkably well preserved by the wallet's protection. She unfolded it carefully and held it up to the lantern light. We both read it at the same time. To whoever finds this, my name is Henry Caldwell. I'm being murdered for trying to expose the truth about what happened at this mill in 1869. If you're reading this, then I failed to stop Elias Mercer. But perhaps you can finish what I could not. The real burial sites are marked on the map I hid with my ledger. This grave was meant for me all along. I just didn't know it until too late. She will finish what I could not. I staggered backward, nearly dropping my shovel. This wasn't Thomas O'Brien's grave. It was my uncle's. He'd been murdered and buried here, in one of the graves meant for the men he'd helped kill. And someone else had been using his name, had inherited the mill, had lured me here. It's a trap, Nora whispered. Jesus Christ, Abigail, this whole thing is a trap. Someone wanted you to find this ledger, wanted you to come here and start asking questions. But why? Why go to all this trouble? Because you're not the only one who wants Mercer exposed. Someone's been planning this for years, setting it up piece by piece. Using you as the catalyst, she grabbed my arm. We need to leave now. If they buried your uncle here, if they've been watching you this whole time. She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes going wide. I turned and saw what she was looking at. Torches, at least a dozen of them surrounding the clearing. Men stepped out of the trees, their faces hidden in shadow, but their intentions clear. They formed a complete circle around us, cutting off any escape. One man stepped forward into the lantern light. It wasn't Mercer. It was someone younger, harder, with a face like carved granite and eyes that held no mercy whatsoever. Deputy Briggs, he said, his voice flat and cold. Sheriff Dunham sent us to bring you both in. Says you've been trespassing on Mercer timber property and disturbing a legal burial site. Legal? Nora's hand moved toward her gun. That's Henry Caldwell in that coffin. Murdered and buried in secret. That makes this a crime scene, not private property. That's not for you to decide. Now put down your weapons and come quietly, or this is going to get unpleasant. I saw Nora's jaw tighten, saw her calculating the odds. 12 armed men against 1 deputy and a schoolteacher. There was no way we'd win a fight. But surrender meant disappearing, probably into graves of our own. That's when I heard it. A whistle, sharp and clear, coming from the forest behind the armed men. Then another, and another. The sound I'd heard in my nightmares. The sound of mill workers signaling to each other across the lumberyard. The armed men turned, confused, as figures began emerging from the trees behind them. At first I thought they were more of Mercer's men. Then I saw their faces in the torchlight, scarred, gaunt, moving with the jerky, unnatural gait of men who'd been dead for decades. Jonah Reed stood at their head, no longer hiding in shadows. Behind him were 6 others, all wearing the rotted remains of work clothes from the 1860s. Some were missing fingers. Others had skulls caved in on one side. All of them had died violently, and all of them had been waiting a very long time for this moment. Run, Jonah said to me, his voice carrying across the clearing. Run to the mill. We'll hold them here. I grabbed the ledger and my uncle's note. Nora grabbed her camera and gun. And we ran. Behind us, I heard shouting, gunshots, and sounds I couldn't identify and didn't want to. Nora and I crashed through the forest, branches whipping our faces, roots trying to trip us. The mill appeared ahead, dark against the night sky. We can't just keep running, I gasped as we reached the clearing. They'll hunt us down. We need to end this. How? By fighting? There's 2 of us, and however many of them are left after... She glanced back toward the forest where gunfire still echoed. After whatever the hell that was. By making Mercer come to us. By forcing a confrontation where we control the ground. I looked at the mill, at the massive saw blade and the heavy machinery. At the bridge that crossed the small ravine leading to the property. Jonah said Mercer's men would come at dawn, so we set a trap. We'd draw Mercer here himself, get him to confess, and document everything. He'll never confess. He will if he thinks we're going to destroy the only evidence that links him to the murders. If he thinks we're about to burn the ledger and scatter my uncle's bones, he'll come. His ego won't let him stay away." Nora stared at me for a long moment. Then she smiled, fierce and dangerous. "You're either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. How do we make him come?" We spent the next 2 hours preparing. I wrote a note addressed to Mercer, telling him I was ready to make a deal, that I'd give him the ledger in exchange for safe passage out of the territory and enough money to start over, that I'd meet him at the mill at dawn, that I'd come alone. Nora rode back to town in the darkness to deliver the note, then circled back through the forest to avoid being followed. While she was gone, I prepared the mill. I found barrels of oil used for maintaining the machinery and poured them strategically around the building. I positioned tools where we could reach them. I weakened the boards on the bridge just enough that they'd collapse under the weight of multiple horses, and I waited. Jonah found me just before dawn. He was alone now, moving slowly, like each step caused him pain. "The others have gone back to their rest," he said quietly. "They did what they could. The rest is up to the living. Did you kill those men?" "We scared them. Maybe killed 1 or 2. Hard to say. When you've been dead as long as we have, you forget how much force it takes to hurt the living." He looked at the mill, at my preparations. "You're planning something. I'm planning to end this, one way or another." "Good." He pressed something into my hand. Another wooden token, this one carved with a different word, witness. Whatever happens, someone needs to remember. Someone needs to tell the story true. That's you now, Miss Turner. You're our witness. The sun broke over the horizon, painting the clearing in shades of gold and red. I heard horses approaching from the south, multiple riders moving at a steady pace. Nora appeared from the north, taking up a position in the old sorting shed with her rifle. Elias Mercer rode into the clearing at the head of 6 men, all armed. He looked calm, almost amused as he dismounted and approached the mill. I stood in the doorway, the ledger visible in my hands. "Miss Turner," he called out, "I received your note. I'm pleased you've decided to be reasonable. I've decided to be practical, Mr. Mercer. I want to live, and I want enough money to live comfortably somewhere far from here. A wise choice." He moved closer, his men fanning out around him. "May I see the ledger? I'd like to confirm it's the genuine article before we discuss terms. You can see it from there. It has your name on every other page. Your payments, your orders, your crimes." His smile never wavered. "Alleged crimes, Miss Turner. Unsubstantiated accusations from a dead man. No court would accept that as evidence. What about testimony from someone who was there? Someone who survived your murder attempt?" Mercer's smile finally faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jonah stepped out from behind the mill into full view. Mercer's face went white. One of his men actually crossed himself. "Hello, Elias," Jonah said. "Remember me? Jonah Reed. You had your men beat me half to death and bury me in the forest. Only I didn't die. I crawled out of that grave, and I've been waiting 26 years to see you pay for what you did. That's impossible. You're dead." "I saw them." Mercer caught himself, but too late. "Saw them what?" I demanded. "Saw them beat him. Saw them bury him. Say it, Mercer. Confess what you did. I don't have to confess anything to you." Mercer's hand moved toward his jacket. "This conversation is over." That's when Nora fired. Not at Mercer, but at the support rope holding up a section of the mill's roof. The rotted rope snapped, and a cascade of timber crashed down behind Mercer's men, cutting off their escape route to the bridge. "Nobody moves!" Nora shouted, working the bolt on her rifle. "Deputy Nora Briggs, you're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." Mercer laughed. "You have no authority here. Sheriff Dunham will have you stripped of that badge before noon. I don't have a badge anymore. I turned it in yesterday, which means I'm just a private citizen, defending my friend from armed men trespassing on her property." She aimed directly at Mercer. "Now, you were about to confess to ordering the deaths of 7 innocent workers. I'll do no such thing. Then I guess we'll burn the ledger and let the truth die with you." I pulled out a match. "Your choice, Mercer. Confess and face a trial, or watch your reputation burn along with the evidence. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not fear of death or punishment, but fear of being forgotten. Fear of his empire crumbling, his name becoming synonymous with murder instead of success. You wouldn't dare. I struck the match, held it near the ledger. Try me. All right. His voice cracked. All right, yes, I ordered it. The workers found out about the falsified land surveys, about how we were stealing timber rights from homesteaders. They were going to expose everything, ruin years of work. So I had them taken care of, permanently. And my uncle, he got cold feet. Started talking about confessing, about making things right. He was weak. Weak men have to be dealt with decisively. Mercer's fear was transforming into rage now. But I built an empire. I own half this territory. You think one ledger and a confession forced at gunpoint will change that? No, I said quietly. But this will. I tossed the match. Not onto the ledger, but onto the oil I'd spread across the mill floor. Flames erupted instantly, racing along the trails I'd created, surrounding Mercer and his men in a ring of fire. Mercer backed away from the flames, directly toward the center of the mill, directly toward the saw pit, the deep cavity where the massive blade sat. The planks covering it were old, rotted, barely holding together. "You're insane!" he shouted. "Maybe, but I'm not a murderer, unlike you." He took another step backward. The boards groaned beneath his weight. Then, with a crack like a gunshot, they gave way. Mercer fell into the saw pit with a scream that cut off abruptly when he hit the blade below. His men tried to reach him, but the flames and falling timber drove them back. They fled across the weakened bridge, which collapsed under their combined weight, dumping 3 of them into the ravine. Nora and I ran from the mill as the fire consumed it, the dry wood going up like kindling. Jonah stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the building burn. As the flames reached their peak, I could have sworn I saw other figures standing with him. 7 of them, watching their burial ground cleansed by fire. By the time the mill collapsed in on itself, sending sparks spiraling into the morning sky, Jonah was gone. The dead had finally found their rest. 6 weeks later, I stood in the ruins of the mill for the last time. The investigation had been swift once Deputy Briggs and I presented the ledger to the territorial marshal. Sheriff Dunham was arrested. The county clerk fled. Mercer Timber Company was dissolved. Its assets seized to pay restitution to the families of the murdered workers. Elias Mercer's body was never recovered from the saw pit. The fire had been too intense, the collapse too complete. Officially, he died in an accidental fire while trespassing on private property. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. Some said it was justice. Others said it was murder. I said it was both, and I didn't lose sleep over it. The families of the 7 workers received proper burials for their loved ones. We exhumed all 7 graves under official supervision, and every skeleton told the same story. Blunt force trauma to the skull, broken bones, violent deliberate death. Thomas O'Brien, Samuel Chen, Marcus Wade, Patrick Donnelly, William Cross, Jacob Dietrich, and in a separate grave, properly marked this time, Henry Caldwell. My uncle's body was given a proper burial in the town cemetery. I carved his headstone myself, Henry Caldwell. He tried to make things right. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that's the best we can do for the dead. Nora Briggs was offered the sheriff's position, but she turned it down. Said she'd had enough of politics and power. Last I heard, she'd opened a detective agency in Portland. Occasionally, I received letters from her, usually with news about some case she was working that involved corporate corruption or labor disputes. She'd found her calling fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. As for me, I stood in the ash and rubble of my inheritance and felt a strange kind of peace. The forest was quieter now. The axes and saws had fallen silent. The footsteps no longer circled in the night. Whatever had kept those men walking had finally released them. I had one last task to complete. I'd brought a chisel and hammer from town, along with a sturdy oak beam salvaged from one of the worker cabins. I set it up at the edge of the clearing, where anyone who came here would see it. I carved carefully, taking my time to get each letter right. For the ones who stayed buried, Thomas O'Brien, Samuel Chen, Marcus Wade, Jonah Reed, Patrick Donnelly, William Cross, Jacob Dietrich, Henry Caldwell. They deserved better than silence. They received better than nothing. May they rest. When I finished, I stepped back and studied my work. It wasn't much, just a memorial in a forest clearing that few would ever see. But it was something. A testament that these men had existed, had mattered, had been remembered. I was gathering my tools when I heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of an axe biting into wood somewhere deep in the trees. I froze, listening. The sound came again, then stopped. The forest settled into its natural rhythm of birds and wind and rustling leaves. Perhaps it was just a woodsman working somewhere beyond the ridge. Perhaps it was the forest itself, remembering what had happened here. Or perhaps some echoes never fully fade. Some memories are too deep, too painful, too important to ever truly silence. I shouldered my pack and walked away from the mill for the last time. I'd done what I came to do. I'd exposed the truth, given the dead their justice, finished what my uncle couldn't. The price had been high, paid in fear and blood and sleepless nights. But some prices are worth paying. As I reached the logging road that would take me back to town, I paused and looked back one final time. The clearing stood empty and peaceful in the afternoon sun. The memorial beam caught the light, its carved letters deep and permanent. But in the shadows at the forest's edge, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing, tall and gaunt, watching me leave. When I blinked, it was gone. The forest keeps its secrets. But now at least it keeps them honestly. The dead are acknowledged. The truth is known. And sometimes, in the deep places where the trees grow close together and the light never quite reaches, you can still hear the sound of axes and saws. Not angry anymore, not desperate, just working, just remembering, just making sure that no one ever forgets what happened at the Caldwell Mill in 1869. I turned my back on the forest and walked toward my future. Behind me, so faint I might have imagined it, I heard a voice carried on the wind. It might have been Jonah's, it might have been my uncle's, it might have been all of them together. Thank you. The forest sighed and settled into silence. But not quite, never quite. Because some places remember, and memory has a voice all its own. And in the Oregon wilderness, where the old-growth timber stands tall and ancient, where the earth still bears the scars of what men did for profit, that voice will never fully quiet. The mill is gone. The men are buried. The truth is told. But the forest remembers. The forest always remembers. And sometimes on nights when the wind blows cold and the moon hangs low, travelers passing through that particular stretch of timber swear they can hear it. The sound of saws and axes, the whistle calling workers to their shifts, the voices of men who died too young, too violently, too forgotten. They say if you listen carefully, you can hear one voice above the others. A man calling out numbers, maybe keeping time, maybe counting something only the dead can see. They say it sounds like Elias Mercer's voice, still walking the forest, still measuring timber and profit, unable to rest because the dead won't let him. I don't know if that's true. I never went back to find out. But I know this: some debts outlive the men who owe them. Some sins echo through generations, and some forests hold more than timber and earth. They hold memory, they hold justice, they hold truth, and they never ever forget. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.